My name is Roman, and I arrived at my new territory on a morning that smelled of pine sap and cold earth. The carriage stopped on a hillside overlooking a wide mountain basin, and a nervous, sweating man came running toward me before the wheels had finished turning. His name was Moore, the local agricultural officer, a plump, trembling figure who couldn't quite decide whether to bow first or wipe his face first, and kept attempting both simultaneously. He had clearly been expecting someone older, crueler, or both. The sight of my family crest on the carriage door had done something to his composure that might take weeks to undo. He had no manner ready, no proper residence, no prepared welcome, nothing that the arrival of a lord traditionally required. He explained this in a rush of apologetic syllables while his small group of workers stood on the cleared hillside, looking like they wished the ground would accept them. I looked past him at the land. Wide, flat basin floor, river to the east, dense forest pressing against the western hills. Good soil moisture. I could see it in the depth of color in the exposed earth, in the thickness of the grass growing wherever nobody had disturbed anything. The air had the particular quality of a place that has been left alone long enough to recover from whatever was done to it before. Other people would see a backwater, a punishment posting, the distant edge of everything important. I saw exactly what I needed. Let me explain the situation honestly. I was the illegitimate son of the Grand Duke of Split Armor, which meant I had the family name, the bearing, the education, and precisely none of the inheritance. I had spent 10 years in this medieval world watching the nobility around me accumulate wealth through methods I found tedious at best and genuinely revolting at most. Wars over grazing rights, marriages calculated to the gram, the elaborate performance of power by people who spent most of their energy maintaining the performance. I wanted something else. I wanted to build something. And in the back of my mind, or rather in a specific corner of my mind that had been inaccessible for longer than I could stand, a game system called Noah's Ark had finally finished loading. The interface appeared as I surveyed the hillside, a virtual map overlaid on the real world, showing the basin in simplified form, my small pixel figure standing at its edge. The system offered me a single mode to start: Life Chronicle. Management, skills, construction, agriculture. It told me I could earn crystals through daily actions and eventually recruit powerful apostles to assist me. I named the territory Origin and got to work. Moore had offered to build me a proper manor before I moved into the territory. He estimated 3 weeks minimum, perhaps more. I told him I wasn't waiting 3 weeks. He had begun to explain the social expectations around a lord's residence when I took off my coat, rolled up my sleeves, and picked up a log. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Even the laborers stopped working to stare at the young noble carrying timber alongside them, which I found briefly annoying. I needed them moving, not staring, but I understood it. This wasn't how things were done. This wasn't how lords behaved. I didn't care about how lords behaved. I cared about the experience points ticking upward in my construction skill, and I cared about the 5 wooden houses that stood finished by evening where nothing had stood that morning. My steward Seth spent the day explaining to me, in various configurations of the same argument, that manual labor was beneath a noble's dignity. He had a face designed for disapproval and was using it to maximum effect. I let him speak because he was thorough, and I could tell he was genuinely conscientious rather than simply rigid, which made him useful despite everything. My 2 young knights, Aaron and Glenn, helped with the construction without complaint. Aaron worked with the focused efficiency of someone who treats every physical task as training. Glenn worked with the cheerful chaos of someone who treats everything as an opportunity to make noise. They had both chosen to follow me from the Split Armor estate for reasons they'd never articulated precisely, but which I understood. They wanted to be part of something that mattered, and they had somehow decided I was the person most likely to produce it. By nightfall, we were in simple wooden cabins, sleeping on plank beds, and I lay awake for a long time studying my game interface and making plans. Dawn on the second day, Aaron and Glenn trained with their steel swords in the morning mist while I pulled weeds. My planning skill was at level 1 and needed to be level 2 before the system would unlock the agricultural knowledge I actually needed proper fertilization methods, seed selection, deep plow techniques, harness improvements. Until then, I was working with what I could observe and reason through myself, which was more than the people around me possessed, but less than I wanted. I had also given Moore a task, a complete census of the territory's population, delivered within 3 days. He returned looking like a man who had committed a crime he couldn't quite name. The real population of Siggy Town was approaching 2,000 people. The official recorded figure, the one used for tax calculations going back 50 years, was 700. Moore explained, with the expression of someone defusing something, that the Grand Duke had never updated the records. The basin had simply filled in quietly, while everyone in the capital focused on more important territories. Refugees who couldn't survive the regular feudal system had drifted here over the decades, found the land forgiving and the agricultural officer reasonably decent, and stayed. The result was a settlement that had grown into something genuinely productive while officially remaining a minor backwater. I spent that evening thinking about population pyramids. The age distribution Moore's data showed was typical of hard times. The very old were few, the working-age adults were more numerous, and children under 15 were the largest group by far. Average life expectancy in this era was somewhere between 30 and 40. What it told me was that Siggy Town had been stable and relatively peaceful for long enough that people were willing to have children, which meant conditions were bearable enough to sustain basic hope. If I could increase food productivity enough to matter, the population would grow. People multiply when they're fed and not fighting. This was not a mystery. I took the information Moore had given me, told him I wouldn't punish him for the record's discrepancy yet because I needed his cooperation more than his guilt, and went back to planning my next moves. On the 7th day, my planning skill reached level 2. The knowledge arrived in a rush that made me briefly dizzy. The sensation of information slotting in a place where there had been emptiness before. Seed selection through salt water suspension. Composting methods for different soil types. Curved plows versus heavy plows, and when to use each. Deep tillage and why it mattered in clay-heavy soil. The unlocked milestone gave me a bonus of 500 origin stones, bringing my total to 1,200. Enough for 7 recruits from the Apostle Pool. The pool itself offered no descriptions, no guarantee of results, no catalog. Just a dim, misty interface with faint points of light shifting in its depths. I counted what looked like nearly 2,000 potential candidates and recognized almost nothing about how the system selected them. I recruited anyway. The first draw produced a 3-star card. The figure on it was wearing a knight's outfit at a Johnny angle, head tilted, expression somewhere between confident and carelessly amused. I recognized the face immediately. Glenn. I stared at this for a moment. Then I started the second draw. 4 stars. Full armor. Stern expression. Aaron. All right. So the apostles were people from my own territory, people I already knew, apparently assigned by whatever logic governed the system. Aaron's stats were clearly stronger than Glenn's across every relevant category, which explained something I'd wondered about during their sparring sessions. Aaron had been holding back, or simply had more headroom to grow. Glenn had always seemed the more naturally gifted fighter. The numbers suggested the opposite. The third draw produced a stranger. Young, sharp-featured, dressed in animal hide with a hunting bow across his back. 2 stars, 5 average statistics across every category, a talent called keen eyes, and a tracking skill. Ordinary by every visible measure. But that was comparison to knights trained from childhood on excellent food and dedicated instruction. Against the actual distribution of humanity in this world, he was probably quite capable. His name was listed as Dota. I didn't know where he was. The remaining 4 draws gave me Seth, my cook Bob, and 2 names I didn't recognize at all, Talma and Barlow. All 1 star, all average, all already on my territory or soon to arrive on it, presumably. For 7 were people I knew. I spent a while thinking about why that felt reasonable rather than strange, and concluded that the system was simply reflecting reality. The most relevant people in my life were already gathered around me. 10 days after arrival, I rode into Siggy Town. Moore had assembled everyone at the public square. More than 1,000 people crowded together, their faces carrying the particular mixture of fear and cautious hope that people were when a new power has arrived and hasn't yet shown its hand. They remembered their old life. They knew that life was about to change. They didn't know in which direction. I let them look at me for a moment. My hair was loose, my posture relaxed, but upright, the way you carry yourself when you've spent a decade learning how authority is performed and have decided to use those lessons deliberately. Then I spoke. Everything they had been doing with the land was now illegal. The fish in the rivers, the game in the forests, the timber on the hillsides, all of it was mine, and they had been using it without permission for decades. Every person owed a fine of 1 gold coin. The square erupted. Cries of mercy, people dropping to their knees, a man trying to rush forward before the sound of 2 swords clearing their sheaths froze the entire crowd. Aaron and Glenn, mounted and silent, held their blades upright in the sunlight. They didn't need to say anything. The message required no translation. I let the noise subside. Then I gave them their choices: pay the fine or obey my orders. Then I announced that all children between 5 and 15 were to be sent to my estate. Then I told the merchants who had been trading in my territory without authorization to step forward. From among the merchants, one young man spoke up instead of simply complying. He was about 20, sun-darkened, well-dressed in a way that suggested comfortable wealth rather than display of it. He said, with a bow, but without hesitation, that all my demands were fair and they would obey. But why did I focus only on small thieves while ignoring the real bandits hiding in the mountains? His name was Mori Perea, son of Selen, one of the kingdom's more significant merchants. I filed him away as someone worth watching. I finished my address, told them their old way of farming was over, that I would redistribute everything and control all resources personally, that disobedience would be punished, and rode back to my estate. Moore sweated through 3 handkerchiefs on the ride back. Later, he said quietly to himself, watching Roman's retreating figure, that this was the noble style he was familiar with, not the kind presence of recent days, the porridge, the manual labor, the working alongside the servants. The iron announcement from horseback that everything had changed and there would be no discussion. He understood now. The earlier behavior had been preparation. You couldn't shock people into compliance if they already trusted you. You had to build the illusion of safety first, then demonstrate the reality of power. Roman had spent 10 days making everyone in Siggy Town relax. Then he'd walked into the square and taken everything. Moore shuddered and went to start organizing the census he'd been told to clean up. Glenn, riding home with his helmet off, gave me the look he used when he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned. I thought you were going to keep feeding them porridge, he said. You know, keep going with not exploiting them. Not exploiting them, I said, using his word back at him. You taught me that one. I looked ahead at the road. What if we really can't eat white bread for a while? Glenn considered this with the expression of someone being asked to solve a problem they hadn't prepared for. Then he shrugged. Then we don't. You're the Lord. We follow. What are we going to do, oppose you? He paused. I don't think too hard about the future. Makes me confused. But I know why Aaron and I chose to follow you. Aaron, riding on my other side, said nothing, but he nodded once. That was enough. Seth's concern about the children was practical rather than moral. Children between 5 and 15 were part of the domestic labor structure. Removing 300 of them would increase the burden on every family that had been relying on older siblings to watch younger ones or on 10-year-olds to help with the simpler farm tasks. He presented this concern in the careful manner of a man who has learned to frame objections as information rather than resistance. I told him I planned to select the most talented ones for proper training and would arrange supervision for the younger children. What I didn't explain, because explaining it would have taken longer than I had patience for, was the underlying logic. Siggy Town's residents were not unintelligent. They were simply uneducated and habituated to thinking within a set of constraints that had been imposed on them by centuries of feudal necessity. Children, before those habits fully calcify, are still open to different frameworks. What I wanted was a generation that had grown up thinking about problems the way I thought about them. The estate became a school. My two clerks, Germain and Hans, were not pleased by this assignment. They had come from city schools expecting positions of administrative dignity, managing accounts, drafting documents, representing the Lord's interests in financial matters. They had not expected to spend their days with the children of medieval farmers, teaching basic arithmetic and letters in a language they didn't consider worthy of serious education. Hans, the braver of the two, informed me they had the right to refuse unreasonable orders and would take the matter to the royal court if necessary. His voice dropped in volume approximately 3 times during this speech, ending somewhere around a whisper. I told them that my wages were generous, that their contracts covered this work, and that I would kill them immediately if they continued to question my decisions. I said it the same way I'd say anything else. No particular emphasis, just information about consequences. They both nodded and went to teach arithmetic. The seed selection method I introduced was simple. Float seeds in clay-suspended water, discard those that sank too fast or rose too high, keep the middle density. I had them do this by hand because the saltwater method required salt, which was expensive enough in Siggy Town to make it impractical at scale. Moore asked why. I told them tools don't need to understand their purpose. This was unkind, and I knew it. But I also knew that explaining agricultural science to medieval farmers before they'd seen results was a waste of everyone's time. The results would do more persuasion than any explanation. The manure operation was less elegant. I needed 100 tons of compost, minimum, to meaningfully improve the soil quality on 2,000 acres. Siggy Town had 80 draft oxen. A mature plow ox produces 20 to 30 pounds of manure daily. Human waste, horse dung, sheep droppings, pig manure. Everything went into the calculation. I organized teams to gather it all, had Moore coordinate the collection, and then personally demonstrated the composting method. Spent 2 hours building a standard hot compost pile in the afternoon sun, sealed it with wet clay, and walked away covered in things I prefer not to detail. The nausea was genuine. I am not weak-stomached, but there are limits. I used the mental focus that 10 years of this world had built in me and suppressed the instinct to stop. If I was going to tell people this was important work, I needed to demonstrate that I thought it was important enough to do myself. The experienced farmers, more quietly noted, would have done this without needing the demonstration. They were used to the smell. The difficulty was entirely in my perception, not theirs. I ignored this information and paid everyone who worked the compost piles an extra 2 pounds of wheat per day. The blacksmith's name was Lax. Thick arms, full beard, the comfortable solidity of a man who has spent his life working with heavy materials. I showed him the diagram I'd sketched, a heavy plow with a moldboard, and asked if he could make it. He studied the drawing with the focused attention of a skilled craftsman. He estimated it would require over 30 genes of iron per plow, plus wooden wheel components, which meant bringing in the carpenter Vitch. Then he mentioned the church. The church, he explained carefully, taught that all tools and techniques were gift from the gods and should not be changed. New inventions were an offense against divine order. If Lax made this plow, he would be going against the church's teachings. I stood up calmly and said that the gods were welcome to tell me that directly. Lax absorbed this statement in silence. Then he agreed to make the plow. The question of why no one had invented a heavy plow for this soil before occupied me for a while. The climate was stable. The soil characteristics were well established and consistent. The need for deeper tillage was obvious once you examined the yield data. Someone should have developed this. The fact that they hadn't suggested either that the knowledge had existed and been lost, or that something was actively discouraging technological development. The church was the most obvious answer. Not through any conspiracy, simply through the accumulated weight of don't change things that work. When working means barely surviving and not working means dying, the incentive to try new methods, which might fail before they succeed, is much lower than it looked from outside the constraint. I needed iron. Lax had 200 genes, not nearly enough for 40 heavy plows. I went to the dock. Mori Perea was waiting on his ship with the expression of a merchant who has been waiting in a place longer than commerce required and is not entirely sure why. When he saw me riding toward the dock, something in his posture changed. A brief tightening, a calculation happening behind his eyes. I asked him about iron. He had 450 genes of high-quality ingots. At 30 genes per gold coin, buying the lot would cost 15 of my approximately 20 coins. I took out a ruby. It was a gift from the Grand Duke of Split Armor when I was born, pigeon egg-sized, a deep red that caught the morning light in a way that stopped Mori's breath for a moment. For someone not yet at the extraordinary level, a gem like this accelerates physical development, strengthens constitution, makes the path to becoming extraordinary faster and more reliable. Worth 15 gold coins, hard to find, the kind of thing families hold for generations. I threw it to him. He caught it and immediately tried to give it back, insisting the iron was his gift to the development of this territory. Accepting payment wasn't necessary. The ruby was too much. I don't accept benefits I haven't earned, I said. You'll be repaid in other ways. He weighed the ruby in his palm, looked at me, looked at the territory around us, and made a decision. He accepted. I also told him I needed 100 oxen before spring ended, and that if he could manage 50 oxen and 100 draft horses instead, the arrangement would work. 2 years of waived business taxes. Mori agreed, trying not to show how much he was calculating. His expression throughout our conversation was that of someone reassessing an estimate they'd already made upward. He also smelled something unusual, and I noticed him identifying the source as my clothing before he politely redirected his attention. The which question arrived on day 9. Moore came to my estate at dawn, out of breath, face pale. Something had moved through Siggy Town the night before. Smoke that entered farmhouses. People woken by a drifting fog. 2 witnesses who had seen something they couldn't explain. After hearing the details, no one harmed, no one missing, the entity had been asking questions. I told Moore it was a witch she was passing through, and we should leave it alone. Moore's expression suggested this was among the more unorthodox responses to supernatural visitation he had encountered. I wasn't particularly concerned about the witch. I was, however, curious about the mountains. Siggy Town had a population I now understood to include, somewhere in the hills above it, a collection of people who had chosen the wilderness over the village. Hunters with established camps, a healer of uncertain background who had lived there so long that even Moore didn't know his origin, a deserter from some battlefield, a wanted knight who had killed his lord, and something Dota mentioned with particular reluctance. A legendary thief named Bog who had been in those mountains longer than anyone else. I decided to go up. The mountains greeted our approach with the specific silence of terrain that has learned to watch. Dota appeared first. He stepped out of the forest ahead of us, a young hunter in animal hide who had clearly been tracking our progress for some time before deciding to make himself visible. He was one of the voices I'd heard arguing in the trees when our small group had walked into what felt like a prepared ambush. "We just want to survive," he said. "If you won't trouble us, we'll contribute the game we hunt." He was about to make more conditions when he saw my expression and stopped. "Then you'll serve me faithfully," I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at me for a moment, and said his name, Dota Jenny. In my interface, his apostle card activated. 2 stars. The same statistics I'd seen in the pool. Average in everything by extraordinary standards, genuinely capable by the standards of the world he'd actually grown up in. Skill, tracking, talent, keen eyes. I told him to take me to the others. Garen, the healer, lived in a wooden house in the hills so thoroughly cluttered with medicinal materials that I had to turn sideways to enter. He was old and deeply unhurried, with eyes that had watched enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. I found a church faith badge among his things. The 33-star symbol, intricate and unmistakable. He confirmed it without drama. Yes, he had been with the church. Yes, he still believed in the gods. He had simply left the institution that claimed to speak for them. I told him that extraordinary healing powers and extraordinary combat powers were both extraordinary powers, and that I had no particular reason to fear either. If his gods wanted to make their position on my plow designs known, they could appear and do so personally. He looked at me for a long time. Before I could continue the conversation, a sound arrived from deeper in the forest. A long, carrying scream, sharp and then suddenly absent. Birds lifted from the canopy in a dark cloud. The subsequent howling and roaring from multiple directions at once suggested whatever was coming was not small. Moore, who had been sweating since we entered the mountains, confirmed his wish to leave immediately. A brown bear appeared at the top of the hill in front of Garen's cabin, 3 meters tall, moving on all fours at a speed that suggested the distance between us was less relevant than it appeared. Aaron braced and blocked the initial charge with his shield, his entire body straining against the impact. Glenn found his angle and drove his sword into the bear's neck. Not as deep as intended, the blade deflecting off dense muscle and bone, but enough to enrage the animal completely. It roared with a sound that rearranged my internal organs slightly. I swung the great bow, shattered armor family heirloom, strung with sea monster tendon, weighted with diamonds at each end, worth more than this entire territory by most appraisals, like a club, and struck the bear across the head. Not elegant. Effective. 5 arrows followed. The great bow's power, even accounting for my archery limitations in a chaotic close-quarter situation, was enough to drive each shaft deep. The bear's movements became increasingly uncertain. 2 guards and a spear to the throat finished it. I stood in the aftermath, catching my breath, covered in blood that wasn't mine, and looked at what remained of my guard formation. Half were injured. 3 were dead. The bear's bile and heart, I noted, had significant medicinal value. We would bring them down. Then Dota identified something that changed the assessment. He crouched near the tree line and said, carefully, that he smelled beast blood grass near the area where the bear had come from. A herb that causes magical beasts to enter berserk states. Rare, difficult to obtain. Not something that ended up near an inhabited hillside by coincidence. Someone had driven the bear toward us deliberately. The witch and the girl were in the forest when we found them. Shasta, who turned out to be the source of the smoke in the village 2 nights before, had tracked a young witch named Gwendolyn to the hills and was in the process of convincing her to leave.